Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Please allow me introduce myself. My name is Eka Dedi Kurnia. I am from Palangka Raya University, Central Kalimantan, Indonesia. Today, I'm pleased to present our study entitled Fiscal Decentralization, Transfer Dependency, and Budget Effectiveness in Resource-Rich Regions. This research focused on district and municipal governments in Central Kalimantan, Indonesia. Ladies and gentlemen, let me begin from the background of the research. Fiscal decentralization has long been regarded as a key institutional mechanism from improving allocative efficiency, public accountability, and the quality of public service delivery by transferring fiscal authority closer to local governments. That was stated by Richard Musgrave in 1959 and Wallace Oates in 1972. In Indonesia, decentralization began in the reform era, which is marked a paradigm shift from the strict centralization of the New Order era to regional autonomy, which granted greater authority to local governments in managing their own affairs. Since that point, also fiscal decentralization were provides broader budget management authority to regions, marked by the transfer to regions or TKD mechanism. Even though decentralization substantially expanded regional expenditure responsibilities in Indonesia, local revenue raising capacity remains limited, which is creating a structural imbalance in subnational public finance. Within the literature studies, there are gaps. First, that many studies focus on national level or based on Java Island. And second, many studies rely on linear modeling approach, which may fail to capture nonlinear relationship. And the third, role of unspent budget balance as an institutional constraint in transforming fiscal capacity into effective public spending was not paying attention properly. In addressing, in order to addressing those gaps, which is mentioned earlier, the study's objectives are to examine the relationship between fiscal decentralization and budget effectiveness at the district and municipal levels in Central Kalimantan. The research objective is to analyze the relationship between fiscal autonomy, transfer dependency to fiscal independence across districts and municipalities in Central Kalimantan during the 2019 and 2024 period, encompassing the pre-pandemic phase, the COVID-19 shock, and the post-pandemic recovery. The research objective is to examine the effect of fiscal independence, transfer dependency on regional economic performance, while assessing the moderating role of unspent budget balance proxied by the Silva. In the framework, we can see that fiscal autonomy and transfer dependency have a direct measures to budget effectiveness. And then the Silva is like the moderating role of the unspent budget balance. Most empirical studies on fiscal decentralization assume linear relationship between fiscal variables and performance outcome. However, in practice, the impact of transfer may be nonlinear. Based on the theoretical and empirical literature, the studies formulates the following hypothesis. The first hypothesis is that fiscal autonomy has a positive and significant effect on budget effectiveness. This this is make the higher on-source revenue, strengthen accountability and fiscal flexibility, improving the quality of budget execution. The second hypothesis is that the transfer dependency has a stronger influence on local spending behavior than fiscal autonomy. That is consistent with the flypaper effect theory. The intergovernmental transfer tend to expand expenditure more aggressively than locally generated revenue. The third hypothesis is which unspent budget balance or SILPA negatively moderate the relationship between fiscal capacity and budget effectiveness. It means that high SILPA levels reflect execution constraints that weaken the transformation of fiscal resources into effective public spending. Ladies and gentlemen, the research methodology which is used in these studies is the quantitative explanatory research, which is designed to analyze the relationship between fiscal decentralization and budget effectiveness. These studies is also have a data panel consists of 14 districts with period from 2019 to 2024. And the research is also use a variance-based structural equation modeling or PLSM method, which is using a WARP-PLS 8.0. WARP-PLS allows the estimation of nonlinear relationship, enabling the detection of saturation or diminishing return effects in the relationship between fiscal transfer and budget effectiveness. Variables and model. Ladies and gentlemen, within the models, we have 3 independent variables and 1 dependent variable. Budget effectiveness is the dependent variable, which is conceptualized as a latent construct representing the quality of budget execution rather than mere expenditure absorption. It is proxied by the budget realization ratio and the share of capital expenditure in total expenditure, reflecting both the timelines and developmental orientation of public spending. The next variable is independent variable, which is fiscal autonomy. Fiscal autonomy is measured as the proportion of on-source revenue or PAD relative to total revenue, capturing the extent to which local government finance their activities independently. And second independent variable is transfer dependence, which is the transfer which region had from the central government. And the third independent variable is SILPA. SILPA are treated as indicator of fiscal slack and institutional execution constraints. and they are measured as the ratio of unspent funds at the end of the fiscal year to total revenue. So the model will be budget effectiveness equals to intercept plus fiscal autonomy plus transfer dependence plus transfer dependence times by Silva plus error terms. Ladies and gentlemen, the result of the studies is divided by four results, which is the first is descriptive statistic. Based on data processing, the descriptive statistic result revealed a highly uneven fiscal structure among districts and municipalities in central Kalimantan. Fiscal autonomy remains relatively low, which is reflected by the mean on-source revenue ratio of 0.114. This pattern indicates that local governments still face structural limitation in mobilizing endogenous revenue source. And the transfer dependency shows a markedly high mean value of 0.823. That is confirming that intergovernmental transfer constitute the dominant source of local government revenue. Meanwhile, the budget effectiveness display a relatively high mean value of 0.885. That is indicating that in aggregate, local governments are able to realize a large proportion of their planned expenditure. And last is the descriptive statistic for Silpa, which averages at 0.126, with several observations exceeding 25% of total revenue, pointing to persistent unspent balance that signal the execution constraint rather than fiscal prudence. Next is the measurement model result. The measurement model assessment confirmed that all latent constructs are measured by satisfactory reliability and validity. Factor loading for all indicators exceed the recommended threshold of 0.70. Meanwhile, the average variance extracted AV values further exceed the 0.5 benchmark. That was indicating that the construct explained more than half of the variance of their indicators. And then the structural model result. It is shown by the average path coefficient APC or and average R square values, which are statistically significant. And the last is hypothesis result. By the hypothesis result, fiscal autonomy has a positive and statistically significant effect on budget effectiveness. Meanwhile, the transfer dependency exhibits a substantially positive, larger, and highly significant coefficient. And then the third hypothesis result is that the interaction term between transfer dependency and Silva is negative and statistically significant. Ladies and gentlemen, the conclusion of the study can be break into four conclusions. The first is that fiscal autonomy has a positive and statistically significant effect on budget effectiveness. That is indicating that locally generated revenue contributes to better budget execution quality. And then the other conclusion is that the transfer dependency exerts a substantially stronger influence on budget effectiveness. It is confirming that intergovernmental transfers remain the dominant driver of local budget outcomes. And conclusion within the SILPA, which is significantly weaken the positive impact of transfer. The SILPA in district and municipalities of Central Kalimantan is weaken the positive impact of transfer, which is indicating that locally generated revenue contributes to better budget execution quality. However, the magnitude of this effect remains limited, reflecting structural constraint in local revenue mobilization and administrative capacity. And the last is the presence of an illusion of fiscal autonomy in resource-rich regions, where large fiscal inflows coexist with persistent weakness in budget execution. The policy implication of the conclusion based on the studies. First, the government is have to have effort to strengthen fiscal decentralization, which should not focus exclusively on increasing transfer values. Second, policies aimed at increasing fiscal autonomy should be complemented by institutional reforms that expand the local tax base and improve tax administration. And the last, the design of intergovernmental transfer should increasingly incorporate performance-oriented mechanisms that reward effective budget execution and penalize persistent accumulation of unspent balance. And that's all. I hope you have a nice view. Thank you for all, and I'm sorry for all the mistakes.